Let's figure out how to write and work with choir libraries in your DAW. Hi there, this is Sam with Second Tier Sound. Really nice to see you here. So I thought I would delve a little bit deeper into choir libraries in your DAW. How do you work with them? What kind of libraries are there? Which one do you need? What are some techniques? What are the ranges? How do you voice? Etc. So let's take a look at that. But first, if you are new here, I do videos about how to compose and orchestrate in a DAW. If that interests you, why not hit that subscribe button? Okay, let's get going. So you might have noticed it's a little bit warm and sweaty. It's very hot here now these days. But anyway, let's talk a little bit about choir libraries and why they're so difficult to get right and why they're quite costly if you want to have a good realistic sound. Most instruments, they do have some variation and different sounds, but they're fairly easy to reproduce in a way because they don't sound too different on each note you play. But a voice is so much more than just, ah, ooh, eh, e. You can have different timbres. For example, I can sing a note or a note. I exaggerated there a little bit. It wasn't that beautiful, but I'm just showing you that that was the same note, but completely different sound. And even though that was a big difference, those small differences happens all the time with real singers. And that's why it's so difficult to create good, smooth legatos that don't sound like, oh, that was a completely new note. Another thing is phrases. We don't talk like this, hello, that would be crazy. But most syllable phrase libraries are created that way, and even though they're pretty smooth between those, they're pretty good transitions, it just doesn't sound good enough because we don't sing and talk like that. We sing in phrases. Singers have to breathe also. That's another thing that a lot of people forget. They just hold this core down forever and we have to breathe. All right. So these phrase libraries that a lot of companies are producing are really the way to go, I think, because then you get that natural legato, the natural way to sing the whole line. And some of these libraries are quite sophisticated. You can even do sort of a chord with legatos in between those notes, but those are quite spendy. I will show you some libraries at the end that are really worth considering, both cheap and expensive. Let's get going with examples. Let's start looking at legato. So legato is one of the most important things that a library needs to get right if you want that realism. So that was a simple ooh sound. This library has a few different vowels, and you can play with those, change them to get some variety, and that will be a good way to make it sound more realistic. It's also important to have a good reverb. A bigger reverb is nice for choirs. They really sound good in a big room, like a church, for example. Depends on the style, obviously. And also work your dynamics. It's very, very important that the library has good dynamics. It really sounds like it's swelling up and down. If you're gonna write several parts with this, then you need to have an advanced library that can do several notes at the same time legato, or you simply write each part. It's not that difficult. You can just start on the piano and then you just pick out the parts and move them to the different channels. So if you want a little bit more realism, you can try phrase libraries. They are amazing, but you have to learn them. They're tricky. So we can take, for example, a phrase here. This is the same phrase or the same line as before. Yeah, that works quite well. It depends on the phrases. These phrase libraries do sound better if you don't use too much advanced voicings and too much melody, but in general they work well. We can show you how that would sound if I have a lot of other voices at the same time. It works quite all right. If I didn't have that reverb on and if I wasn't totally into choir, I've been working with choir all my life. I've taught voice and choirs. You might not notice the problems that are in there. This is a good library, but I do hear that this sounds a little bit, and that is because I have quite a lot of advanced quick changes in the voices. So one trick is to just add another instrument, for example, the piano. Or a whole orchestra, obviously, that would do the trick as well. Now, one thing a lot of people might wonder about is like, what are they saying? Doesn't that matter? Well, take any choir piece that you know, even real singers, and well, it's even better if you don't know them, and just see if you can find out what they're saying. You can't, and I think there are funny videos out there where people have put new text on choir songs because it sounds like something else, and you really don't have to worry about that. It's not something you need to buy. If your library says, we can sound like real words, there's no technology out there that can really do that well. And it's a lot of work to get that right. I would say just make sure you have a few different phrases and sounds and you'll be set. Well, let's look a little bit at a phrase library, and we can use that to look at voicings and some ranges and some ideas. Let's start with the ranges in a choir. Now, you can go very nerdy on this and you can figure out all the 8 different parts that a choir has. Most choirs have 4, bass, tenor, alto, soprano, but you can even go up to 8, and some crazy people do even more than that. But 4 is the most common, and then you could work all those ranges if you want to. But I'm going to make a simple version for you, and I want to say that F is basically the lowest note of the men. Obviously, some basses can go lower than that, and some men can go that low, but F is a good low note. It's just, you won't run into problems. I would say 2 octaves is the male range. There we have it. And obviously some tenors can go higher than that, but this is a good, comfortable range because you don't want to hang out too much in these extremes. You want to be in that area. And women, I want to say from A to F. They can definitely go higher than that. But we're talking about comfortable ranges. That sounds pretty good in general, unless you have extreme loud chords. So you could say really from F to F. It's good to be there. You can definitely extend, but that's good range. That usually works. If we work with a virtual orchestra, then we can just do whatever we want. We can put our, arm on the keyboard and it sounds okay almost anyway. But it's good to know these things in order to find more realism. Okay, so let's look at voicings a little bit. And first thing is, if you know how to voice on a piano, you pretty much know how to voice a choir, more or less. And if you know how to do strings, you also know how to do choirs, more or less. The only thing you have to think about is the range, because obviously the string family and the piano can go way beyond that. So if you have a really low bass note, if you want to transfer that over to a choir, you just have to up an octave or whatever, so it fits. But otherwise, the voicing is pretty much the same. In general, it's hard to do voicing really wrong on choir, unless you should put all the bass notes down here with closed voicing, But the funny thing is, it kind of still works because you get an effect. It's possible to do that. But otherwise, put a little bit bigger intervals in the lowered register, And up here, you can definitely have more closer if you want. And another good thing about voice is that almost any kind of chords work. You can pretty much try any different kind of chords and it kind of almost always work. But there's one trick I really like about voice, and that is close voicing, like tight. What do I mean with that? Well, if you take a very simple C minor chord here, so what can we do to enhance that? Well, we can add those extra notes that are in between and they're very close to each other. So we can add a 9 or a second, the D. So what does that sound like? It still sounds like a C minor, but it just adds that nice texture. And you can add also the 4th. Now, you could try that with other instruments, but not all instruments do that well. But as I say, voice, it does it really well, and you create great atmosphere. So always play with that. Even if you don't know how to make chords, just try a simple triad and see what happens if there are any nearby notes within the scale, within the chord, that works. So let's try a simple example with simple voices. That kind of works, there's nothing wrong with that. But you can add a lot of small notes there. Do you hear? It sounds fatter, more interesting. Now, it depends on the style, obviously, but in general, you can always add in extra notes in choirs. And a trick is also to make sure that those extra notes are not as loud as the other ones. If you don't want it to disturb, then it just adds a feeling of, wow, there was something cool there. Some other things you can do in choir that is really nice is, I don't know what to call it. I'm sure it has a name, but I call it just step chords, which is completely the wrong name, but it doesn't matter. You will understand what I mean. You can build a chord up with all the notes in a scale. So like this. It sounds really, really good. So even though all those notes are together, you just add a nice texture, and voice lends itself really, really nicely to that. When you just try an idea out on the piano, it can be nice to just do simple block chords with a good library and see if it works. But something to remember is that just like strings, choirs like movement. To just sing the same note all over and over is boring and exhausting. So you really want to look into that part writing a little bit more. So if you start out with chords, then remember to later add in some movement in the choir. It sounds more realistic, it sounds more interesting, it's more fun to sing if you intend to do it for a real choir as well. And something you cannot forget, which a lot of people do, is that choirs need to breathe. And even if you work with a synthetic, virtual library, it just sounds better if you have breathing spaces, because that's what a choir sounds like. You can't just go on and on and on. If you want a choir that sounds fairly realistic, remember they have to breathe. So do phrases, and as I always say, sing your lines, and then you will know what to do. Let's look a little bit the differences between a phrase library and what I call a syllable library. Most choir libraries that are a little bit cheaper, and at least back in the days, are what we called syllable, or what I call syllable libraries. Maybe they're different names. Let's call them syllable libraries. So what is that? Well, let's listen to it. If I have a syllable here, and each time I hit, there will be a different sound. So it's a very good library, this actually, because it's easy to get those lines, but they don't work very well if you want to do a phrase or something put together. I'm going to show you what I mean. Here I've created a little small example, and this sounds okay. What I've done is that I have longer phrases, and then I have changed the syllable in between. So and that's not bad, actually. But if you pay attention, you hear like exaggerating, but it sounds a little bit like that. There's no connection between the lines. So a phrase library is what takes care of that. So let's listen to the same thing. Now, it depends on the style, obviously. If you want the choir to be alone, then the phrase library is what you need. Otherwise, it's not good enough. But if you do have an orchestra, it kind of works. Let's try first with the syllable library, and we have an underlying orchestra here. So it works quite well. I don't want you to feel like you have to go out and buy a phrase library because they cost more. So I do want to say that both these libraries are very useful. And if you're starting out and want a cheaper library, you should probably go with the syllable library because you kind of can do what the phrase library can do. Not on its own, and it doesn't sound as professional, but you can do it. Also, a syllable library can do something that a phrase library can't, and that is staccato, that is shorts. Now, there are newer, bigger, expensive libraries that can do all of it, and I'm going to talk about them later, but for just showing you, because when you start out, maybe you don't want to pay so much money for a choir library that you might not use that much. Let's just hear first what I've done with the syllables here. And this particular library is really good because it makes the phrases for you. Each time you hit the key, there's a different sound. But a lot of libraries out there, you have to program in that yourself. There's something I want to mention also when you work with these libraries, both in Legato and Staccato, that singers do have like all that. And that is at the start of the library. So you have to pay attention to that. If you see here, all these things, I've moved them to fit the rhythm. Because if I have them completely with the grid, and let's have a click here, it's completely off, right? Because singers start with a louder sound. It's not like a note instantly, that comes just a few milliseconds later. So now, with a click, you will hear that it fits. And most choir libraries are made that way. So that's something you really have to pay attention to. And some libraries I've tried, even different words have different lengths. And that's, it's quite a lot of work to get that aligned properly. This library have managed to not do that. So I will tell you later what the library is. Let's see what it sounds like with a whole orchestra. So you get, and something to mention here, very, very important, singers are not loud. Well, if there are 1,500 of them, obviously, but they're not as loud as an orchestra. So you really have to pay attention to the volume, and you also have to pay attention to register. In this case, I have a woman choir playing up there. So make sure that the orchestra plays down there, so they're not in the way, so they're out of the register. And that's the way you can have loud sounds playing at the same time and still hear the choir really well. So I did promise you I was going to talk a little bit about what choir libraries are worth your time. What should you get? What's a good start library? Well, let's start with the most expensive ones first. And we're talking about the Domino Pro by Fluffy Audio, which is probably, if not one of the better libraries out there. In any way, it can do anything you need. It has fantastic legatos, fantastic phrases, fantastic syllables, great dynamics. It's just a really, really good professional library that I highly recommend if you got the cash, though. Then Spitfire has a library that is about in the same league, but I feel like it targets a little bit more sound design and more detail. And it's not the way I work, but there's nothing bad about the library. It's just a different way of working, I feel. So I prefer the Domino, but the Spitfire Whittaker library is definitely in the same league, and it's fantastic. Then a little bit cheaper, we have the Storm Choir by Staccato Sampling, I think it's called. Somebody will tell me if I'm wrong. Very, very good library. Easy to work with, has a lot of nice tricks to make your workflow faster. So that one's worth checking in, and it's also a lot cheaper, or not a lot, but it's a little bit cheaper than the libraries I just mentioned. Then I do want to mention the East and West Hollywood Choir, because if you have the subscription, then it's a no-brainer, then use that. I do want to say, though, if you don't have the subscription, I do not think it's a library worth your time. It doesn't mean that it's bad. I just think for that price, there are better libraries out there. It doesn't have a legato, not true legato. And the phrase builder, even though it sounds cool, nobody will know what phrase you put in there unless they have the text in front of them. It doesn't really make a difference. And I feel like it's clunky, and it doesn't have nice transitions, and not as nice as, for example, other libraries do. So it's a good step in the right direction of interesting technique, but I don't think it cuts really what's the word? Anyway. Another one I really want to mention is the choir libraries of 8DO, and they might feel expensive when you go there, but they often have a sale on the choir libraries, and then they're really reasonable. One thing you have to know though, these libraries are very specific. They do one thing very well. They're not, they can't do everything well. So in Syllables, for example, is an amazing phrase library. It's just beautiful, so inspiring, but it's also very low dynamic and it's slower and it doesn't do short, fast stuff or epic stuff at all. It sucks at it, so it's not meant for it. So think of 8DO as specific libraries for specific things. And all those choir libraries, they cover everything, but you have to see what do I really need. I'm mentioning it again because it's good quality and it can be really cheap if you look out for a sale. Then probably the best tip, and especially if you're new, if you don't have a choir library, is to look at the ARC 1 and 2 by Orchestra Tools. You might say, wait a minute, ARC 1 and 2, they're quite expensive. They cost as much as the other choir libraries. Well, first of all, if you do get the whole ARC 1, you do get a fantastic orchestra that has pretty much everything you need for epic orchestra. But if you download their free sign player, you can download just the instrument you want. So you can download only the choir or even only the female choir. And that choir is really good and will cost you 50 euros, probably closer to $60. I don't know what it is. So you get a choir that is really, really well optimized, can do pretty much all you need if you're starting out, and it has that random syllable, so each time you hit the chord, you get a new sound. It's really, really effective. It's probably the fastest, best library for the buck out there. So look at that. The ARC 1 is a little bit more epic, more vibrato in the singers, and the ARC 2, they have a name, but I forgot what it is. You have to look it up. Is a little bit less vibrato, a little bit smoother. Yeah. Okay. So that's it for this time. I hope this video really helped. You looked in a little bit to the difficulty with libraries, what you should get, how you should look at voicing, and some tricks that you can do to make it sound more realistic. If that really pleased you, I hope you hit the like button and perhaps tell everybody else so they can check out this video too and perhaps subscribe as well. And also, if you want to help me even further and you want to get more perks and perhaps get more advice, you can ask me more questions about the choir, for example, you can always join my Patreon where you will get access to my private Discord server. You can talk to me or the other ones that are there already. I hope to see you soon. Take lots of care.